Hey everyone, and welcome to Generative Now. I am Michael Mignano. I am a partner at Lightspeed, and this week on the podcast, I talked to Madhumita Murgia about the human consequence of AI, which she writes about in her new book, Code Dependent, which is out now. Madhu is a journalist based in London, and she's the AI editor of the Financial Times, where she covers how new technologies impact people and society. Madhu and I talk about the current impact of AI across the world and what guardrails builders and investors like you and I should keep in mind as we build the future. Hey, Madhu, how are you?
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Really appreciate you doing this. I feel like this is a very exciting time to speak with you. First of all, you're the AI editor for the Financial Times, so you're covering lots of really interesting stories all the time right now. And you also have a book coming out. Congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, so it's been out in the UK a couple of months and just out in the US now. So fresh off the presses for you guys.
Awesome. Congratulations. What's it like? Is this your first book? And if so, what's it like to now be a published author?
Yes, it is my first book, and it's been a wildly different experience to being a journalist. It's kind of interesting because when you have to write something at 80,000 words, you have to just think about it so much more deeply than when you're engaging with it on a sort of day-to-day or even a weekly basis. And even though I've been writing about AI for more than a decade now, since 2013, I've been writing about AI. This was like one of the most intense 2-year periods, I think, when I had to kind of write at that length, forced me to kind of engage with it at a deeper level. So it's been great though. And it's kind of interesting that it's opened up new spaces for me to talk about AI in. I think people see authors differently to journalists, still kind of see journalists as dabbling in things, whereas if you've written a book about it, I think that earns you the right to have more opinions, which is fun.
Yeah, well, it definitely sort of like cements you and cements your perspectives and your opinions sort of in the history book, so to speak, of a topic or of a subject, which is pretty interesting, right? I mean, especially as this space is naturally going to keep evolving so quickly, like this book sort of becomes a checkpoint on where we are right now. I actually like one of the things that I feel like must be challenging, and I'd love to hear a little bit about it and how you manage it, is the fact that this space, AI, it's moving faster than pretty much anything I've ever seen before in tech. And obviously the process of writing a book, it takes a really long time. Everything I've heard, it's like a 2-year journey at least, or maybe 18 months. What has that been like? Like, how do you decide to write a book about AI and then everything changes every 3 months while you're writing?
Yeah, I think the sort of cognitive dissonance of how fast changing the technology is, and as you pointed out, the very glacial nature of book publishing, was an interesting contrast for me. As I said, I started writing about AI technologies in 2013. So I think it helps to have some perspective, right? If you have just started covering this topic or looking at it 3 years ago, then it probably feels really overwhelming and maybe kind of pointless to write a book in that kind of time scale. But for me, I felt like I had some sort of step back perspective and was able to kind of look at that arc and then think about what is it that I want to bring to this story that hasn't already been told. And of course, while I was writing this book, ChatGPT came out. So, things changed pretty dramatically, literally, as I was finishing my first draft. Literally, I filed it in December of 2023. 2022, just as ChatGPT came out. But I think what for me makes books lasting compared to a news story or an article or a blog, it has to have something more than just like, here's what's happening, right? That's the point of a book, is to outlive just the current moment. As you said, it's a snapshot of history, and it helps you think about things differently. That's the kind of role that a book plays. And for me, the focus had been on human beings. This book is not a book about technology. It's a book about people and how they use technology. And so actually it doesn't matter that the tech itself changes. All technologies technologies are constantly evolving, right? I mean, you know this, but the way that we use it is the kind of interesting, it's almost like the sort of sociological story, and it will hopefully help us grapple with AI going forward as well, because you can kind of take those experiences and apply them. So that's kind of what I hope this book will do. It gives us that human perspective against a very quickly changing backdrop.
So maybe taking a step back, you mentioned you've been writing about AI since 2013. How did you get into it? How did you start getting interested in the space to the point that you were writing about it? And were you writing? Were you covering for Financial Times back then, or were you somewhere else?
No, so I was trained as a scientist. I was an immunologist working on vaccine development, actually, but decided to make the shift to journalism at a point, when I decided science as a career wasn't quite for me. And my first job as a journalist was with Wired magazine. And, you'll know Wired. It has a very sort of devoted following of entrepreneurs and amazing innovators and inventors. I myself didn't know the publication very well. I came to it as a sort of science nerd, which is fine. We embraced all kinds of nerds at Wired, but tech was new for me, and I kind of thought I would write mostly about science and health, which were my areas of expertise and interest. But it was 2012, so it was a really interesting moment in tech, right? It was when we really had sort of the mobile economy taking off, the app economy, and the birth and growth of many of the major companies that we know today, right? The Ubers and the Airbnbs, these were all tiny startups. Even, Facebook at the time, still small. It was its moment of like kind of explosive growth. It was when DeepMind had just been founded, and literally as we were writing about it, was acquired by Google. So there were all these things happening in tech, which meant I was witness to that at a very early stage, and I learned as I went along. And that's also when AI was starting to become interesting again. As you and your listeners will know, AI has gone through these cycles of winters and summers over the last sort of decades. But in 2012, it was becoming more sort of interesting to entrepreneurs again, to Demis at DeepMind and others as well. And so I was just interested as somebody who'd studied neuroscience, and it felt like the coming together of that and tech. So very early on, I started looking at academics working on this, and then just stayed with it from Wired to the Telegraph, and then eventually at the FT.
It must be a fascinating time right now over the past 18 to 24 months covering this space for FT. Obviously, so much has happened. You mentioned ChatGPT came out as you were writing the book. I mean, give us a little sense of what it's been like over the past 2 years, when it feels like there's literally a new, jaw-dropping story in the world of AI, like almost on a weekly basis.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's hard to separate from having watched it all, but then also coming at it from the outside, to get an external perspective, to think about, like, was this inevitable given what we've been seeing and writing about over the last few years, or has this really come out of nowhere? Because for a lot of people who've only now started paying attention to AI, the narrative is as if it's out of nowhere, but obviously it isn't. It's been built on these decades of work in terms of the algorithms, the data, the infrastructure, and the money, of course, that's been pumped into it over more than a decade. And so in some ways it is inevitable, but still, even as somebody who's looked at it for a long time, it feels kind of amazing and magical to see the leaps and bounds of the improvement of the technology itself. And in terms of covering it, I think what was amazing to me is, like, prior to 2023, I would write about it, and we would always have, our readers were really interested in AI as a topic because they found it kind of intriguing, as this sort of cool, cutting edge thing, a bit like quantum computing, right? Which I've also covered and written about, where it's kind of like, don't really get this, but it sounds cool and it sounds like we should be paying attention. And so that was kind of how readers framed it. But now, the big change is nobody, we just can't get enough of it. It's like an insatiable appetite. People want to use it, learn more. So from a journalist perspective, it's interesting because it's just like, we just want more stories. Whereas prior to 2023, it was more me being like, guys, we need to write more about this because it's really cool and it's going to be a big thing. So the dynamics of that have really changed both internally and externally. I think the other big change is, you know, trying to separate the wheat from the chaff now a bit, because there is a lot of hype. And pretty much everybody will come to you from every different industry, not just tech, right? In insurance industry, retail, advertising, media will come and say, we're using AI for X. You know, the legal industry, we have law firms, consulting firms, everybody's trying to jump on this bandwagon. So a big part of my job is to be that person across the newsroom who, you know, sector experts will say, is this really AI, or is this just something that they're repurposing, which is something more statistical, you know, or like straightforward statistics rather than machine learning or deep learning, and to kind of separate that hype out from the real stuff. So I feel now more my job is to say, no, we shouldn't write that. Whereas previously it was kind of like, this is amazing and this is something we should write more about.
How do you make the determination whether or not something's worth writing about when again there are so many exciting things happening on the surface, at least?
Yeah, you know, this is the core competence of any good journalist. That is the whole job, right? It's how do you figure out what's a real story? How do you pick out the winners? I remember when we were when I was at Wired, we used to do this series called 100 Hottest Startups, and we would pick different cities across Europe. It was European focused. So, you know, we would look at Tel Aviv, Paris, Berlin, and so on, and try and figure out what are the 10 hottest companies in this ecosystem this year that we should spotlight. And we would get, you know, VCs and other people that are part of the ecosystem to nominate. And I remember then thinking like this is the hardest job, because there are so many great companies in all of these places and we could just pick any 10, but how, you know, we want to make this a definitive list. And like the process that worked for us then, for me then, and I think I still apply now, is triangulation, right? It's something that, you know, I did as a scientist as well. Like how do you, so you need to find the experts. So you need to find as many of them as you can, and they need to be across a cross section. So it can't just be investors. Of course, they're part of it, but it's also the scientists who work in universities. It's sector experts, whether that's, you know, great law firms or whoever that is. And the people, you know, you need to identify the people who have real perspective across, you know, cross industry as well. And once you find like, you know, 50, 60 of those people, it's talking to them. It's like gleaning their expertise, their sort of, what are they excited about, what trends, what companies, and then putting that all together, and then doing that very human thing of sifting through it and making a judgment call. So there's no formula, I guess. And I think you'll know that, you know, as an investor too, you start to hone that instinct, or whatever we call it, the sixth sense, but you need to first put in the groundwork, right? You need to talk to all the experts. And then you start hearing again and again, this, you know, this is the next really exciting thing, or this thing hasn't quite worked out. So, you know, we're not too worried about that or whatever. So yeah, I just try and continuously talk to as many people as I can in the space, leaders, CEOs of all the major companies, try and check in with them as often as they have time for it. But also talk to entrepreneurs, you know, with starting new companies who are excited and building on top of the big platforms too, to see like what are their pain points, what are they excited about. But yeah, we're learning too, just like everybody else.
Right. So I want to get into the book in a little bit, but maybe while we're on the topic of your reporting at the Financial Times, I thought it could be interesting to start by just digging into some of the stories that you've written about recently, or maybe some of the things that are top of the mind. You know, for example, it seems like you write quite a bit about OpenAI. I know you recently wrote about Universal Music Group and YouTube. Maybe like what are some of the most interesting stories that you're thinking about right now that are very topical within AI at the moment?
In terms of buckets, I would say we're really interested in the players, of course. And for us, that's the big corporate players, because we cover large corporations, and our readers tend to be, you know, policy people, government leaders, and big business owners, and people who run big businesses. So they want to know how is this going to affect me? So we're really interested in the sort of Silicon Valley race dynamic: who's winning, who's losing, how are the companies comparing against each other? What are the sort of interesting political stories there? I mean, within the companies and between them, what's happening between Microsoft, Apple, and OpenAI, for example? Where does Anthropic fit in? What's Amazon looking at? And then Google, is it falling apart? Is it working out? Like, where is it going to end up? So the big corporate sort of the personal dynamics, as well as like how are they building a business out of this? That's something we really care about. I would say the second bucket is the application layer, right? So we're at a point now where billions, there's been reporting saying trillions of dollars going to be invested into AI to get us to the next stage. What are we building with it? And is it going to pay off? Because again, that's for us as a financial newspaper, a big question is like, what is the business model, right? And there are some, OpenAI has been, revenues have been going up. They're making money. Clearly, people are interested in consuming the product. Same with, Microsoft's Copilot. But is the investment that companies are making in this technology going to be worth it? So I think I'll be looking quite closely at that. What's the bear case as well for this, or do we think that someone like Nadella or Altman are right when they say this is just going to pay for itself? And I think talking to investors will be interesting because curious to hear a VC perspective on that too. And then of course there's regulation is a big question and a really fascinating one at the moment. And that doesn't just include like sort of AI regulation. It's like other regulatory issues that including copyright. I think that's a really live issue. So the YouTube story kind of falls within that bucket, right? Who are the parties making deals? What are the size of those deals? So like how much are we valuing this type of data? And how is the law going to shake out on that? We have live cases between the New York Times and OpenAI, and there will be others as well, not just in news publishing, right? In music and video and so on. So we're really interested where it crosses over with other multimedia too, like Disney and others. So yeah, and so regulation is a broader thing. Of course, the AI focused regulation will be interesting to see what the White House and other countries, China, India, etc., put out. So those are the three main things. But for me, the really important fourth one is the actual technology itself. That's what I'm really interested in personally. So like the cutting edge of the actual software. So where is this technology going? What are the big sort of breakthroughs that we're seeing, like that people are publishing in this area? What are the new capabilities that we'll be seeing with new generations of this model, and the path to sort of more intelligence or general intelligence? How are we going to get there, and what are the various ways that people are trying to get there? I think that will be really interesting to see as well. So we'll be doing more explanatory stuff too.
Yeah, that last one is interesting. You hit on a number of topics that I think are really interesting that maybe we can touch on. But maybe starting with the last one, the technology. You mentioned general intelligence. I think either just yesterday or maybe it was this morning, there was a story about OpenAI developing this new sort of internal system of measuring intelligence, like this 1 through 5. Supposedly they're already at 2. Like, where do you think we're at on that curve of reaching general intelligence? And what do you think, some of the highest level societal impacts of that will be if and when we do reach that?
Yeah, I mean, that's like the $1 trillion question, I guess, right? But also
Yeah.
an open scientific one. It's not clear to me that anyone is really aware of the exact sort of levels and exactly where we are or how soon we're going to get there. And having spoken to some of the real experts in the space, I saw that what you mentioned about OpenAI having this internal kind of ladder, but it's internal and there's no like external validator for that. There isn't any sort of evaluation mechanism or criteria that help to we don't have like the sort of criteria that tell us when we get there, right? And so anything that a company comes up with is just, they're creating their own standards and then defining it by their own standards, which I guess is a start, but I don't see that as the sort of objective scientific measure of anything, personally. But I think, in terms of where we are, again, this is what, my understanding gleaned from having spoken to people in this space. It's people certainly are surprised by how far large language models have taken us forward. I think that, the previous sort of understanding was more that you needed other types of intelligence that included sort of visual feedback, for example, reinforcement learning from your environment in order to create general intelligence, and that purely like language wouldn't be enough to kind of create a breakthrough. But actually, it's been pretty good at simulating intelligence, and it's able to leapfrog a lot of what experts have thought was required. Jan LeCun talks often about, as humans, we can't just learn from reading, we learn from sort of physical feedback and visual and auditory feedback. And so he thinks you need that kind of a breakthrough before you're going to get anywhere near general intelligence. But language has been pretty amazing, as I said, at sort of simulating or leapfrogging. But my understanding is we need at least one or two more major breakthroughs, like of the level of a transformer or more, before we're going to get there. It's not just a sort of an obvious predictive path from here on to general intelligence. I think it's going to look more something like that, and that's what we've got to wait for the sort of researchers to do. And I think there are lots of ideas out there, but nothing that's already worked. So I'm not sure if that's a cop-out answer, but based on how much investment,
No, I think it's a good one.
yeah, I mean, it's going into people seem to think a decade is a fair prediction, which I think a decade feels like a good amount of time considering how much money is being poured into this.
You also talk about regulation as one of the main buckets and topics that drives a lot of your coverage. I think, obviously, anytime there's a new technology, there's a lot of talk about regulation, potential regulatory capture. And I think it's possible we're entering sort of a new phase of that, right? There are, as you mentioned, a number of lawsuits being directed towards startups. You mentioned the New York Times OpenAI case. There have been a number of lawsuits from other directed towards other companies like Anthropic, from Universal Music Group and the music industry. At the same time, you mentioned a story that you'd covered recently around Universal Music Group and YouTube working on a deal. And it strikes me a little bit that this may actually be another form of regulatory capture where the big players, the incumbents, the big tech, are working together. Meanwhile, it almost seems like they're working to kind of crush little tech or kind of keep them out, by weaponizing existing legal frameworks. I mean, is that sort of how you see it in your research and your reporting, that we're sort of at risk in this technology wave of a new form of regulatory capture from big tech and the incumbents? And are startups just going to sort of get left out in the cold?
That's interesting. I hadn't so much thought of it from that perspective. I was thinking more of like sort of tech versus media, right, as the two sides of this. But it's true, there's only so many companies that can afford to make deals with the FT, News Corp, with some of the biggest publishers and music producers around the world. Every startup isn't going to be able to go away and pay for that. And then if they then license all of the data and it becomes exclusive to them, then I guess it's going to be much, much harder to be a breakthrough startup that's trying to build something in this space, unless you're acquired by or somehow connected to one of the big tech companies that own these licenses. So I think you are going to see that kind of split, and I'd be curious to see how startups will get around that without the data that they need to train models, and whether you just start to have, maybe that's the business model of the models companies, right? That startups are going to have to license or pay for those because they can't afford to build their own even small or medium models without paying off all the big, data owners. From a reporting perspective, it's kind of fascinating and exciting, right? Because it's a whole new industry. There'll be new business models and dynamics and new sort of applications born of that. But and I guess like from a startup perspective, like it's a challenge. There will be ways around it, but it feels like the big model owners are going to win for sure. But to look at the other side of the coin, it's a really expensive endeavor too, right? It's not as easy as just, oh, we'll pay you monthly for your models and that will be enough, because it costs so much to not just, yeah, training is, I guess, the big cost, but even inference, to kind of run the big data centers, and to kind of maintain those models. So it's hard to know whether that will even be enough to have a healthy business if you're just building these large language models.
What about, you mentioned sort of tech on one side, media on the other side. Obviously, the approach that a lot of these companies are taking in these sorts of debates, it seems to fall along the line of sort of fair use and the definition of the law. And in many cases, it seems like the law is actually in favor of the tech companies and this existing definition. Do you feel like we have the right legal structures in place to guide this technology, or do you expect that maybe the whole system needs to be sort of rewritten for this next phase of media creation and innovation via AI?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to a few different copyright lawyers about this, and I've never seen lawyers this excited, to be honest. They're just like, this is amazing. This is an era of innovation for copyright law. And genuinely, they feel like this is an intellectual sort of moment, for the work that they do, because it's kind of a philosophical question of like, if an AI system writes a piece of music or story, like, does it own that? Is it something that it could copyright? Or if it's being trained on something I wrote or something you wrote, is it just reading that and coming up with something itself that's original? Or is it essentially just repurposing and like regurgitating what we've created? And it's, I think by current laws, as you say, the fair use, it seems to work in favor of tech companies. And, the argument is it's not just regurgitating. These models are sort of creating their own new work based on this. And it's the same as sort of reading this work. I think there's going to be, it's going to be a lot less simple than that. I think there will be change in the law here in the UK. The Intellectual Property Office was sort of trying to reconceive this whole thing. And when generative AI burst into it, they've paused the whole thing and they've done a new, they've basically what they call a consultation, where they've gone to all of the experts in the space, which includes artists and so on, and lawyers, to say, okay, maybe we need to come up with a new law that reflects this new technology and where the data is coming from. But there's a lot of opacity around where that data comes from. So I think it's hard for anyone to really have a view without understanding what the data is, and secondly, how this works. What does it actually look like when a deep learning algorithm repurposes or remixes the words that it's learned from and creates something new, right? It's until we can really see that, it's hard to determine, I think. So it'll be really interesting to see how it pans out. But I think there will be change.
Okay, let's talk about code dependence. So this is your first book. We talked about it at the beginning of the episode. Again, congratulations. I have a number of specific questions about the book, but maybe to start things off, why don't you give all listeners just sort of a brief overview and synopsis of what the message you're trying to convey with this book?
Yeah, sure. So, for those who've listened to the first half of this and think this is a book about the business of AI, it is not. Um, it is about people. And so, for me, the what I felt nobody was writing about in the time that I'd been looking at AI closely was how it affects ordinary people, just people like you or I, in the real world. Teachers and doctors and workers, and children. And I wanted to kind of understand, we talk so much about the impact of AI and what it can do to change our lives. And I wanted to really figure out, what does that look like? And I knew that we didn't have to wait for the future because it was already happening. We've already had forms of machine learning, more primitive forms of AI over the last decade or so. And I know that there are places that this has already been in action and has already changed people's lives. So really, this book is about how AI in reality is changing lives of people across the world. I traveled to over 9 countries and look at this in very different cultural contexts. I went to Kenya and Bulgaria, India. The book goes to China and the Netherlands and the US and the UK. So kind of all of these countries around the world, looking at how AI is changing our lives in practice.
And who are some of these people? And maybe more specifically, what are the ways in which you feel like AI is already impacting their lives?
Yeah, so I went into it just looking for interesting stories of people who'd sort of either been impacted by AI or had helped to build it, or had helped to train it even. And so I started off in Nairobi, speaking with data workers, which are these workers. There are millions of them now around the world. People will know of companies like Scale AI now, and Mighty AI, Sama. These are all outsourcers that employ data laborers who are kind of low skilled, low wage workers in the developing world who help to train AI models. So I traveled to their homes, and to their work to see really what that looks like when you're labeling algorithms for Tesla, for Meta, for Walmart, for OpenAI, a youth in a slum in East Africa, and how that impacts your life, both for better and for worse, right? So I was trying to understand like what is the economic opportunity here, but also, uh, uh, are these wages fair? Are these working conditions fair? And as we move into an era where we're going to have more and more data training requirements, RLHF is, the human reinforcement that we're using to fine tune AI models. That's all done by people. So as we do more and more of that, this is the moment we need to figure out whether this is a fair labor market, whether people are being treated well, whether, companies are in fact taking advantage of them. So there's the story of the workers, the invisible workers that train AI systems in places like Sofia and Nairobi. Then on the other end of it, looking at sort of experts, I traveled to India where I met with a doctor in a very rural part of the country who was using an AI system to help diagnose tuberculosis amongst her population of tribal patients. And that was really fascinating because for her, it was, this amazing tool that could reach people in parts of the country that never, ever saw trained medical professionals, let alone, forget doctors, not even like nurses. And where something like this could literally save lives, because it's a quick and easy way to triage people who have tuberculosis. And through all of these stories, I wanted to understand not just whether AI is good or bad, which felt like very easy, a simplistic dichotomy, but more to kind of understand the nuance of it. What is a good way to apply an AI system in a way that it works well? And how does it go wrong? When it fails, when it harms and hurts people, why does that happen? Is it the tech? Is it the way it was designed? Or is it the sort of human part of it, which is how it was implemented or controlled or overseen? In most cases, I would say I did see harms that the technology was bringing to vulnerable people, but it wasn't necessarily just because of the design of the technology. It was often because we hadn't thought through how to sort of integrate it into our lives properly and how to maintain the sort of dignity of humans alongside the technologies that we're putting out into the world.
What can you speak to some of the specific harms that you mentioned, and also maybe how potentially we could have rethought rolling these things out to prevent them?
Yeah, so one kind of interesting example. So I tell the story of a single mother in Amsterdam, called Diana, and she had 2 young sons and was notified one day by letter that her 2 sons were on these lists that the Amsterdam's mayor's office had put together, and the lists essentially were saying that her sons would go on to commit serious crimes. One of her sons, 16 at the time, had committed one crime, and the other one, who was 14, had never ever committed a crime. But these lists were put together based on predictive algorithms that looked at data like whether someone had been a victim of a crime, a witness to a crime, whether you lived in a neighborhood with high levels of crime, and other things like truancy, the people you're related to, the people in your social circle. So it was it was done by criminologists, and it was supposed to not necessarily to be punitive. It was meant to identify these. They were mostly so. What was interesting is it was supposed to be race blind, gender blind, all the things we say about AI systems, right? Like they can be unbiased if we ensure to design it that way. But in practice, over 90% of the children on this list were boys. And of those, most of those were immigrant families, mostly from North Africa into Amsterdam. So even though the algorithm was supposedly blind to race and gender. In practice, what was supposed to be a sort of welfare measure to, for the mayor to sort of help these families keep these boys on the straight and narrow, in practice, what happened is it just broke apart hundreds of families, right? It made the boys feel they were under a microscope. They got in more trouble than before. The police were calling them out by name on the street, so it made them feel they were already criminals. The parents were cut out of this whole process, felt like this was their fault. It's social services threatening to take the kids away. So it ended up having the opposite effect, and that, as I said, fracturing these families and these boys much. Maybe it's hard to compare to, what is the counterfactual? What if this algorithm had never existed? Would this still have happened to the boys? But certainly the introduction of it had this ripple effect on this community, right? So yeah, I mean, I think for me, actually, the takeaway isn't it crazy to have a Minority Report style algorithm deciding if your 14-year-old will be a criminal, which sounds crazy in itself. But I actually think that the more egregious thing is how it was done, because maybe you can use data science or AI, whatever, to create to find families that need help. But really, when you implement it, it's about how we do that, and sending a list to a parent without informing them why their child is on this list or what they can do to get off it. It's like, it's obviously damaging, right? And I think, like, as a parent, I can say that would be very disturbing for me. And so now it's still running the program, but they've changed it so it's much more community based. So they have, community meetings where they include the families and kind of talk them through what they need, and it's far more supportive rather than this sort of punitive punishment kind of measure, which actually some of the families find helpful. So that's, I think, an example of how you can implement an AI system in a kind of bold and unhelpful way.
Yeah, it almost seems like, I mean, per your point, you said the book is really about people. It's almost less about the technology and more about people. And in this case, it strikes me that this problem, this issue with this technology, identifying these people, creating these issues for these families, feels like the result of a choice by the police, by almost like sounds almost like a police state type of environment with excessive surveillance.
Yeah, if you think about the Netherlands, it's a very, very social, state. There's a lot of sort of welfare and support. So it's a really interesting direction for that government to go in, and unexpected.
Right. Yeah. Super fascinating. In the book, you drop a list of guiding principles for AI, and again, per what you said about how we can use AI. Talk us through these principles. What are they? How do they work?
Yeah. When I got to the end, for me, the whole book was about really, it's a reporter's book. I'm telling the stories of these people, and I wanted readers to be able to engage with them and see themselves here. Like, even if you don't live in Amsterdam, you might live somewhere where police have tried out some of these systems. These are all global ideas that are being kind of thrown out around the world. And I wanted people to read those stories, see themselves, to empathize, and then to feel empowered about, okay, I should have a voice. I don't want to walk into a similar type of situation in Illinois or in London or wherever I am in the world, right? I kind of felt like my role was to be a witness to these stories and to tell them. But when I got to the end of the book, I felt like, while I don't want to prescribe all the solutions, because that's not, what I wanted to get from it, I had learned a whole lot through the reporting of the book about how, not just how AI works or is implemented, but how it goes wrong, how you can do better when in giving people agency, how you can regulate better. And so I kind of decided at the end that I would come up with these 10 very simple questions. So it's nothing fancy. It's not like some kind of, high minded ethical principle or anything like that. Is a simple set of 10 questions based on the people stories that I had been reporting over the last 3 years, that I hoped anybody could ask themselves if they were to be confronted by the various issues. So I think I start with, the data labor question. If we do have outsourced labor that's helping to build AI systems, what does a fair wage look like? Can we decide, what is that wage? And there are questions around, and similarly on the other end with copyright, how do we value the data produced by human creativity, whether that's music or words or video? What is the value of that? How should we be compensating humans for the work that they have put into training these systems, and what should that look like? I have questions around accountability, which I think was for me the key issue here. In so many examples of the stories that I tell, there's no human accountable for the outcomes of AI systems. And that connects back to really what we know about the science of even generative AI today, right? Like, we know that we don't have clear evaluative measures. The science of evaluation is still very much nascent. There's no way to do like a third party eval of all of these systems. And that means it's really hard to hold them accountable for any of the outcomes, right? Yet we're implementing them already in healthcare, in deciding what people should be paid for gig work, in, recruitment, in etc. Like in all of these various parts of our lives, they're already being implemented, but we don't even know how to account for them. So it's, for me, another question is, who is accountable for the outcomes, and do I get an alternative? If I don't want an AI decision or outcome, do I get a human alternative for that? And I think that's key to any regulation that will come in. And then how do we, and then finally questions about the outcomes themselves. How do we know if something is biased or discriminatory or wrong? How do we measure that? And if we can't measure it, should we implement it at all? We wouldn't do that with a drug or a vaccine, right? Or a teaching method or whatever, if we didn't know for sure it wasn't harming our kids or whatever. So why do we do it with AI? So it's pretty like practical, I guess, and gleaned from these stories. But I think it's a start as people start to design systems and also design the regulations that will go around them.
There's obviously a lot of discussion, in the public, perhaps in your book, around who should govern AI. The legislative bodies, the creators of the technology themselves. We talked a little bit earlier about regulatory capture. I mean, who do you believe are the stakeholders in this conversation, and perhaps how can they use the principles that you just mentioned to figure it all out?
Yeah, I think that's the really, really like key question for me. And maybe it's at the heart of what my book is about. It's like, who's allowed to have a voice when we build a technology that's so consequential for all our lives? I've talked through a couple of examples already, with criminal justice, with healthcare. These are really, vulnerable moments of our lives, changing so much so quickly. And yet currently, the loudest voices are mostly the companies building them, and of course now with regulators, governments will have a say as well. But I think if we want to really benefit from the technology, to get the most out of it, because I still, the book is dark in terms of looking at the reality of like how AI is changing things, but it's not because I feel pessimistic about its future. I think it's more, for me, a warning sign saying this is what's happening. How can we do better as we continue to build? And I think for that to happen, there need to be a more pluralistic input from other parts of society too. And I don't just mean different genders or different races or even different countries, which there should be. You can't really build a system in California that gets used in rural India and think it's just going to work out fine. Like, you do need to have input from those countries and those governments. But more than that, I think like other competencies, too, right? That, we need, of course, technologists and regulators, but we need, teachers and lawyers and writers whose work is being used to train these systems, the creatives, civil society activists. I talk about some of those in my book, who are looking at legal ways to fight back against some of the harms. Experts in all these ethicists and sociologists. I think there's so many aspects of how this changes our lives that we need the sort of like humanities expertise and also just kind of citizen voices in there. And for me, a really good example of how that's been done before is with IVF in the 50s in the UK. When it was invented in a test tube for the very first time, it was like hugely both consequential and controversial, right? In a time when a far more religious time, to create life in a test tube was kind of mind-blowing that a scientist could do that, and obviously quite sort of controversial when you thought about only God creating life. And there was a lot of pushback then globally, I think in the US too, about, do we want this to even happen? Should this be allowed? And in the UK, the government put together a commission headed by a philosopher called Mary Warnock. And she basically put together her group of experts, and that included sort of ethicists and philosophers, but also, of course, biologists and chemists and others. But also she brought in parents and other citizens who were going to be affected by this. And the Warnock Commission wrote this report, which basically said, we think this is a good technology that can do amazing good for the world, but here are the ways it could go wrong. And so here's what we think should be the sort of the guardrails around it and how we should do it. And that's still the document that sort of oversees and underpins IVF regulation in the UK today. And, nobody can argue it's been really life changing for many, many around the world. And so I think that's a really sort of empathetic and, for me, like a holistic way of approaching how a technology should reach people.
Fascinating. Madhu, last question. You mentioned the book explores, these stories, which again, represent potentially unintended consequences of technology. You mentioned the book is dark, but you also mentioned you're optimistic about the future of the technology. Are there any areas where you feel like AI is having a really positive impact today, and changing things for the better today? And maybe what are those?
For me, I think health is the area I'm really excited about. I mean, I'm slightly biased coming from my health background or my biology background. But even within the book, when I looked at the ways in which AI was being used to help with diagnostics in particular, and not just in India, right? Like, it's been used to help diagnose breast cancer and other types of cancers in the West. COVID, it's just like it could be an amazing bridge, particularly at a time when even in the West, we have, a huge gap in the number of trained experts, radiologists, and so on. And, the burden of aging is really kind of making healthcare systems creak and struggle. I think AI can play an amazing role there, in kind of bridging the gap that we have. But it's not just for diagnostics. I talk in the book, I spent time with Ziad Obermeyer, who is both an AI scientist and an emergency room physician in Berkeley, in California. And he's done some really interesting work to show how you can use AI to kind of solve medical mysteries and really essentially to kind of help us to understand more about human biology and medicine than we know today, which is pretty amazing in my view. If it can be a tool that helps us to do better science and get us to, creating scaled error-free quantum computers or materials that are, energy saving, or drugs that can, resolve illnesses that we don't know how to today. That for me would be just, like a huge win in itself. Even if it didn't mean we all retired and we're on universal income and didn't have to work anymore. Even if we didn't get to that point, I think just using it as a tool for scientific discovery will be an amazing thing to have created.
Madhu, thank you so much. Codependent is the book. I learned a ton. I'm sure listeners did as well.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Thanks for listening to Generative Now. If you liked what you heard, please rate and review the podcast at Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That really does help. And if you want to learn more, follow Lightspeed at Lightspeed VP on YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, everywhere else. Generative Now is produced by Lightspeed in partnership with Pod People. I am Michael Mignano, and we will be back next week with another conversation. Thanks so much.